Hey there, Ahmed. How you doing?
Hi, James. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm really glad to connect.
Oh, me too. Me too.
We can keep it to 45 minutes if that's more convenient this time. Anything in that kind of range is good for
I
me.
think that sounds perfect, actually.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Let's do that.
Thank you. Give me 1 second to.
Yeah, no rush.
I noticed you had sent the link, but for some reason it had not come through my my calendar.
Oh,
It was
okay.
on
Sorry about that.
my phone and my calendar. For some reason, don't sync together. Not exactly sure why.
Yeah.
So I just had to copy and paste it.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I usually send over by email. I was about to do that now. So anyway, you
Yeah,
made it, so no worries.
exactly. No, it's all good.
Great. So we can dive in if unless you have any
You
questions
want
or
to,
anything.
before we start, can you tell me just
Hmm.
a little bit about the audience
Yeah, of
and
course.
what the target sort of folks are, just so I can kind of
Yeah, yeah.
get a sense of things?
So people, so yeah, non-duality, mysticism, contemplative practice, that kind of stuff. I think people would be more familiar with Buddhism and things like that rather than the Sufi path.
Yep.
But then also, yeah, my background is I'm a neuroscientist, so I think people often have a kind of yeah, I think
Jordan.
traditional institutional religion that doesn't have the mystical bent. I think it's often people
Yep.
who are kind of rejecting that and looking for something that isn't based in dogma or yeah. So I think they like the sciencey thing, but it doesn't mean I'm not expecting this conversation to have that kind of secular scientific bent. I like to cover the whole range of interviewing scientists and contemplatives. So yeah, that's the audience.
Yeah, and is it geographically defined in some ways, or is it kind of broader
I'd
than
say
that?
broadly English speaking world. I think it's pretty evenly distributed. I think just based on numbers, I think North America is more overrepresented, but there are Australians and Brits and some Europeans. Yeah, and then lots of Americans.
Yep. Sounds sounds lovely.
And
Sounds
I've
lovely.
recorded a bio that will be stitched in front, so people will have some background on you. And is it Safi? Is the way to pronounce the
Yeah,
second name?
both of the I's are long vowels. So it's Omid Safi.
Omid Safi, right? Exactly. I
Yeah.
heard you say it on your own podcast, so I was trying to make
Yeah,
sure I got it from that. But
that's
Omid
right.
Safi is
That's right.
great.
And just as a backup, I may also go ahead and see if I can record it on my computer. Just
That's good.
hit it erases or something.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
your email only just came through now for
Yeah.
some reason. Let me approve that. Great. Yeah, I'm glad. I always have my whole Zoom room is always set to automatically record because I'm terrified. It's never happened, but I'm always terrified I'll forget to press record. So
It happened
the
to
idea
me
of having
two
a backup
times
is. Oh,
where
really?
I've had like a whole conversation that I've had, and then it ends up that
Yeah.
none of it has actually been recorded.
Yeah. My horror is imagining it happening halfway through and then deciding like, do I tell the guest or should I
Right,
keep up the
right,
charade?
right, right. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, we can dive in if unless
Sure,
you
please.
good to go. All right. Okay, I'm here with Amid Safi. Amid, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you here. And maybe we could begin with for people who are not familiar with Sufism and the kind of mystical strands of Islam. Maybe we could begin with a bit of an overview of what Sufism is.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, it is essentially the contemplative and mystical dimension of Islam. And, that word mystical gets thrown around a lot by different people. And what we mean by it is simply that notion of mystery, that there is a mystery about what it is to be human, to be fully human. And there's a wonderful saying in which God says, "I am the secret of humanity, and humanity is my secret." And so, what would it mean to think about a way of inhabiting this human existence that encompasses and includes our physical being, that honors the body not merely as a kind of suitcase, if you would, for spiritual experience, but something quite essential. Um, and also goes on to say that the deeper that we go, or if you prefer, the higher that we go, the closer to a divine reality we get. Um, and how do we access that? And how do we live at that level? That's really the focus.
Right. And you've written a book called Radical Love, and you have this wonderful podcast, Sufi Heart, and it really goes into these teachings on love as the thing we orient to deepen into that. And I really enjoyed an episode where you were talking about the different kinds of love in Sufism. I was wondering if you could share that with the audience.
Absolutely. Some time ago, I was I was flying somewhere, and there was one of those magazines in the pocket of the seat in front of me, and I pick it up, and it said something like, uh, "Are you looking for love?" And I thought, well, aren't we all? And in one capacity, it seems like, half of the songs and the movies out there, in some ways, have to do with love. And yet, why is it that so many people come to describe their life and their very existence as loveless or deficient in love? And part of that is because, particularly in a Western tradition, we have tended to collapse all of love into a physical, romantic, um, sexual, even kind of love between two people or more people, I suppose. Um, and the Sufis, in a way, are pushing back against that. So our friends are teaching a kind of expansive notion of love, which would certainly include love that we have for our fellow human beings, but it could also be friendship. It could also be the love of a parent, of a child, of a neighbor, of a stranger, of a tree, of a cat, of the breeze, of sunrise and sunset, of angels, of dreams, of illuminated beings, of prophets and prophetesses, and ultimately God. And so in that sense, it's it's a kind of reminder that our very existence owes itself to love. We are born out of love, that love is the cause of all creation. And it's it's the not the lack of love that we oftentimes suffer from, it's the overabundance of it. And but it's because we have settled for this very, very narrow part of the rainbow that we're missing out on everything else.
Right. And the that sense of love, in my own experience, I feel like different spiritual practices that might point to awareness or connection or openness, like they all love, they all seem to converge to me to a fundamental orientation towards a way of being, which you can label anything you want because it's deeper than words. But it does love does feel like the word when you're talking about this expansive, very grounded, it feels existentially grounded, like yeah, as you say, like the fabric of reality or the very source of being is some outpouring, some openness, some unbounded, infinite, generative outpouring, which is, and we're fully part of that. So yeah, what you said at the beginning about I think both God as that generative ground of being, and then us as well. The whole thing is love. It's a big love in, and we kind of we turn away from that and overlook it. But then when you turn towards it, it's already the case. It's already the context that we're in.
That's right. And part of the mystery of love is that so often we're trying to conceive of love and perhaps live a loving existence while keeping the ego, this
Mm.
finite limited self, at the center of the cosmos. Um, and there are at least two fundamental errors with that. One, this notion that our being is, in fact, this finite, limited self, as opposed to being something that is interwoven and interconnected with everything. So part of our contemplative traditions and practices are to help us realize that, in fact, you and I do not end at the tips of our fingers. That we are deeply intertwined with the earth, that the water, the liquid that flows through us is fundamentally no different than the water that is flowing in the streams or in the oceans or falling from the sky or springing up from under our feet. Um, and that the breath that we take, which has, of course, such a connection with the spirit, um, is the same breath that the trees and the birds are taking in, and that we're linked in that way together. So to begin with, this notion of a finite, limited, small self. And many of our sages, people like Rumi, keep reminding us that you are not this small world. You are, in fact, the grand universe itself. Why are you settling for so little? Uh, and then the second part is to have that sense, that illusion of a small self somehow placed at the center. So we think about love as if we have to generate it and then project it towards others. And since we've defined it as something romantic and sexual, it's usually something that we want it to be radiated towards one particularly attractive person. And half the time, we end up brokenhearted that that attractive person doesn't feel like reciprocating our love, or anticipating it even. And instead, what the Sufis talk about is not so much, like some superhero cartoonish figure who just has beams of light and laser pointing out from them, but it's the experience of standing outside under the rays of the sun. And that the source of love is actually God. And in fact, God is not merely the alpha and omega of love. It's not merely the beginning and end of love, as of course we see in certain lines in the New Testament, but also in the poetry of the Sufis, that God is love. That God is love. And we are the recipients of love. We might be the mirrors of love, to use language that is very Islamic in its origin. We are the moons of love, reflecting the light of love, reflecting the light of God, and its origin is from elsewhere. Its origin is divine.
And you mentioned Rumi there, who I guess if people, maybe if even people who are not familiar with Sufism, they've probably heard of Rumi, and I think I think there's a Rumi quote that goes something like, "Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open?" And that, I mentioned earlier the thing of that love being the context in which everything's playing out, but that we overlook it and we kind of we create this prison of, I think that the kind of subject object love you describe there, the romantic love is almost, it's a game of overlooking, like, I need an object. It can't just be abundant. It can't just be here. It can't just be free. I need to struggle for it. I need to be playing out with my attachments. But yeah, then there's the door is wide open. It's just this openness that's all around. And is Eshk the word for this kind of love in Sufism?
That's right. In Arabic and Persian, also in Turkish, Urdu, in many Islamic languages, that's the word that I've translated as radical love.
Hmm.
So we have another word, mahabba, which is, if you would, loving kindness. That's a kind of gentle love that is soothing and comforting. Um, and it seems to, at least at one level, either come from the word for seed. It's a seed of love that's planted in your heart, or according to some, it's a bubble, a feeling of loving kindness that bubbles up from inside of you and pops as a glance, as a word, as an expression. Ishq is different. Ishq is radical love. Ishq is a raging fire. And it's something that, as the Sufis say, burns everything except for Allah. So all ego, all selfishness, all the me-isms, all of that pharaoh quality that we all possess in some capacity that wants to be the Lord on high, that is burnt away, leaving only you, O divine beloved. There's something about love when it's pure, which is the antidote to ego, because love directs itself towards the beloved. And there's something about that ability to transcend attachment to one's own ego, which is alchemical and salvific, in fact. And, you mentioned that, beautiful um, teaching of Rumi. Sufism, very much like Buddhism, very much like the Christian contemplative tradition, these have all been traditions, right? They've always been a series of, um, we would call them illuminated beings who are in touch with one another in both a spiritual realm, but also an earthly, historical realm. And it's the same way with Rumi. He was already called in his lifetime the offspring of the soul of the Prophet Muhammad in this case. And so he has a deep love and attachment, as one would expect from a Muslim mystic, to the Prophet Muhammad. And he's also been raised with the teachings and the stories and the poetry and the anecdotes of the mystics of Islam who've come before him. There's a particularly amazing female mystic named Rabia, probably the most famous of all the female mystics, maybe someone akin to a Hildegard, if you would, in the Christian tradition. And, there's a wonderful anecdote about Rabia that she's walking past a mosque one day, and there's a preacher on the pulpit, and he's essentially paraphrasing the famous line from the Gospels, ask and it shall be granted unto you, knock and it shall be opened. And Rabia pauses in her tracks and pokes her head in and says, "What did you say?" And this preacher is apparently a little annoyed that this woman has interrupted his majestic speech. And so he says, "Woman, I said, knock, and it shall be opened unto you." As in, don't just barge in to the mosque when I'm preaching, knock first. And Rabia says, "Fool, from where I am, the door has never been closed." The door has never been closed. So, as you said, we keep thinking that we have to knock and knock and knock at God's door for it to be open. The door is never closed, and maybe there's not even a door. Rumi grows up with that story, but of course, this is a tradition which is like a river. It's flowing, it's alive, it's a part of a transmission and internalization, and then bringing your own fruit to it. So these kinds of living traditions are not ever content to simply um, faithfully capture, like a museum artifact, the teachings of the past. They also want to add their own genius and their own gift. So Rumi comes up with his own quatrain that says, "My beloved friend, you have spent your whole life knocking and knocking and knocking at God's door. Sweetheart, you're knocking from the inside." Um, and that notion that we are already home, that there is no place outside of God, that we are already enmeshed in God. We are inside of the divine, in the same way that the fish are in the ocean. And so imagine a fish that's going around going, "Where's the ocean? Where's the ocean?" Fish don't have a word for ocean, because they are of the ocean, they are in the ocean. And if they were ever lifted out of the ocean, would be the only time they would be aware. But how could we be somehow outside of God? What is that place that is beyond the divine? There is none. So I think it's that kind of a shift in perspective. We don't radiate love. We're standing under the rays of the sun. We don't have to knock until somehow we have earned the door to God being opened. We're already inside and knocking. That kind of a shift in perspective is really crucial for the Sufi tradition. And it's what some of our sages call the antipodal moment, where the ego, which has insisted on looking out at the universe, experiences a shift in its perspective. And instead of looking out at the world, you experience yourself being looked upon by God.
The the way you describe that reminded me of a poem from the Christian mystic tradition. I can't remember, it might have been Hildegard you mentioned, or maybe St. Francis, but it's the translation I read was something like, "Such love does the sky now pour that I have to wring the light out of my clothes when I get home." Which I really liked, and that combination, just you can imagine the mundane, kind of like almost it's annoying that God's so saturated you with love that you have to, that it bleeds into everyday life, into those everyday chores.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what if we were able to have a kind of existence that categorically refused a distinction between something called spiritual and something called mundane?
Mm, yeah.
What if we were able to think of it as the life that we live at home, that the cooking of a food for our family members, that that's spiritual practice, that cleaning up after the mess that our children make, that that is a spiritual practice, and that the work that we have out in the marketplace, um, how we glance upon the people that we come across, that that itself is the very stuff of of the path. And I think there's really something very profound to take to heart there.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was. It said it by I heard from a Zen teacher once describing that the essence of Zen is doing whatever you're doing it fully, like whether it's the washing up or just being fully present with it. And that's always stayed with me. And every time I do the washing up now, it feels like a kind of an act of devotion or service of just being fully absorbed and um, yeah, not letting yourself believe there is a separation between anything, between mundane and spiritual, and yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly. I think that, wisdom from the Zen tradition, from the Christian contemplative tradition, is the very same insight. We should never be surprised when we hear um, the one truth echoing from many different traditions. And, Rumi says it very beautifully when he says, "There's one light, though it comes through many lamps."
Hmm. I love that.
And, in the world in which we live, because of many competing movements, nationalist movements, ideological movements, and even, one has to admit, a certain kind of marketized view of spirituality, where people are competing for hits and clicks and downloads and subscriptions and all of that. Um, People almost treat it as a kind of capitalist Olympics of spirituality. Um, and what if instead we were able to recognize that water is water, And as we say in our tradition, here we call it a river, there we call it an ocean, now we call it rain. This one we call the Atlantic, that one we call the Pacific. But there's only water. And then what if we also realize that we ourselves are mostly water? Um, so I think that's kind of where we're trying to get to.
Yeah. And so I feel like for some people, this emphasis on love could be quite healing to hear because I grew up in a time where there was a kind of a grotesque, simplified caricature of Islam that came from a very Islamophobic place in Britain and I think across the Western world. Um, and I think to buy into that grotesque caricaturing is wounding to the people who buy into it, and so it's healing to see uh, to have contact with the reality of these traditions. And so I think that the diversity of traditions within Islam, I'd love to hear you speak to that because before, as I was prepping for the interview, I was actually ended up on the Wikipedia page for progressive Islam, and you were the first person who was mentioned on the text by the second or third sentence. So I was like, okay, yeah, this seems like something that might be up your street.
As a as a person who is very blessed to inhabit this brown body, um, I'm certainly not ignorant of the ways in which um, animosity, prejudice, discrimination, hatred, violence against Black and brown people, Asian people, queer people, poor people, undocumented people. It's um, it's a crisis of the world that we live in, and in some ways, we only have to look around the world, and as that great poem by the Somali British poet Warsan Shire says, I ran my fingers across the atlas and I asked it, where does it hurt? And it said, everywhere. It hurts everywhere. So, we can go around the world. Again, this is not an Olympics of suffering. Um, whether we're talking about Myanmar, the Rohingya, India, Kashmir, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Yemen, my God, Palestine. Absolute, unqualified
Hmm.
disaster of genocide that the
Yeah.
world is witnessing um, and because of the will of a couple of superpowers seemingly unwilling to stop it. Um, and it goes on and on. Of course, there's no nation has a limit on it. We are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, the prejudice against Hispanics and people of African descent, so on. Um, so I'm not unaware of the ways in which in Europe and in North America, prejudice and discrimination against Muslims has now moved very much from the fringes to the center.
Hmm.
In many European countries, political parties which explicitly run on an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant platform are now routinely getting about 30% of the vote. And of course, in my own home of these United States of America, we have now a re-elected rapist and a felon, um, 34 cases of sexual assault against him, who ran on a campaign of the Muslim ban and with the ungrammatical um, example of prejudice married to bigotry, married to an ungrammatical articulation when he stated that Islam hates us, um, as if Islam could somehow be the subject of a sentence. Um, and I say all of that recognizing that the primary victims in these cases are Muslims, people sometimes imagined to be Muslim, African Americans and others, as we've already talked about, Asian folk. And yet, at the same time, we as a human community are deeply, deeply intertwined. Whatever it is that affects one directly affects all indirectly. So, whenever you have individuals and a community, and in this case, well over half of my own country, that harbors prejudice and discrimination, hatred, and the intention to commit violence against a people and a tradition, it is they themselves who are also poisoned.
Mm.
That's the thing about prejudice is that it poisons the person who lives with it. And if you come from a contemplative tradition in which you hold that healing and wholeness is the birthright of all of us, yes, you begin with the ones who are closest to the pain. You begin with the ones who are the direct recipients of discrimination, but you also reach out in compassion and say, I wish for no one to live with the kind of hatred that you're living with. I would actually wish for you. That's what I would wish for the supporters of Trump. It's what I would wish for Israelis and supporters of the Israeli government. I would love for you to be free of the fear and the hatred that right now is emanating so clearly from you. And I would love for you to know the sweetness of dignity and freedom and justice for all. And I do think that's it's a better way and it's a higher path.
I saw yesterday just a random person commenting on someone's post on social media saying they're basically saying that they stated as a fact that they in their worldview every single person is prejudiced against someone. Everyone harbors hatred in their heart against some group, and that's the human condition. And that felt it was really heartbreaking to read that someone believing that because the this is the profundity of the radical love message that to to see things that way and to feel that you have to hate, that you have to other, that you can't put yourself in a position to extend love to absolutely everyone. Um, yeah, that's. I mean, that is the poison of the small self of feeling. Um, yeah, that you can't. It's like the love opens you it beyond the delusion of separation. So you in the first instance, if you stand with if you do something as simple as telling the truth about what's happening in Gaza, and then the superpowers that don't want you to tell the truth, it make your life hard for you. But if you do that, that can take you in a step in the direction of overcoming the sense of the small self, of identifying with, what does James want, what James needs, to actually living from that place of deeper principles of love, connection, truth. But then, as you say, beyond that, the ultimate challenge is extending that radical love to the perpetrators as well, to the people, to know that even Trump is you with different conditioning, to know that there is no, that we're all the same, we're all the emanation of the same thing. We are all each other. And it's the way you described it really hit this balance that I strive for, which is I found it's possible to always be fully open-hearted to everyone whilst also being firm on the relative level of calling out injustice. So what you said about, Trump or these states and with their actions, you can absolutely describe it. It's not hateful or close-heartedness to describe accurately the harm that's being caused, but there doesn't have to be the poison that poisons oneself and the world behind it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think here I'm a lot of the what informs my life and the life of so many people doesn't just come from scripture or from some book of medieval mysticism. It comes from living or striving to live a life as a full human being. So if you have two toddlers, you can take pretty much any two toddlers and put them in a garden and they will play together. They don't pause to ask, is brown and is that one Asian and what language do you speak? And toddlers will sometimes play together for 3 hours, and then you're like, "What was your friend's name?" Like, I don't know. I don't care. You were just playing. And that's our what we would call our primordial nature. That's our true self, is to play together, to live in the same sandbox,
Mm.
the only box in the whole cosmos that we have. I'm here on the side of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, who correctly say hate is not innate, hate is learned. And
Mm.
if it has been taught, if we have been taught to hate, then we can be untaught, and it can be replaced by something like love, which is actually much closer to our divine nature. The one thing I would add, just as an addition to what you said, um, about everyone has prejudices, which of course is true. Sometimes when we go to it and we just leave it at that, or if we leave it at that, it can sound like, well, I'm prejudiced against such and such a people, and you're prejudiced against that kind of a person. And so, see, we're all equally messed up. Um, and maybe from a point of view of all of us falling short of our essential divine self, absolutely. But what's interesting is that, the very definition of racism, it's not just prejudice, it's prejudice and power. It's
Mm.
prejudice and the ability to translate that prejudice into a systematic and structural way to make life miserable for some other people. And in this world that we both create and share, there are some folks who have access to unearned systems and institutions and superstructures of wealth and power that make that kind of a prejudice and hatred a little bit more likely to be actualized. So I think for those of us who care about love and we want to be on the side of love, we have to recognize that same truth that the Sufis have said, that the Black prophetic Christian tradition has always said, which is that all that we mean by justice is love when it comes to public. That if you love the folk, you cannot be silent when you see the folk being bombed, when you see them being starved, when you see them being occupied or discriminated against. Love compels you to say something, to do something. Um, and, I think in this way, sometimes I do find what we're called to do is to be a mixture of the great love of Rumi with some of the truth telling of someone like a Malcolm X, which is, when he says things like, I would love to love my oppressor, but I can't do that as long as you've got your boot on my neck.
Right.
Actually, before you can ask me to love you, I need to remove your boots that are pushing me into the ground. I need to pull out the knife that you have in my back. And I think that's a really powerful insight as well, that the language of love, as we were talking about it earlier, it's not only spiritual and otherworldly, it's very much also something of this world. It's about the wrinkled stomachs of the hungry. It's about people living under war and occupation and homelessness. Uh, and that task of love and illumination and spirituality is also about learning to share this small third rock from the sun.
Yeah, thank you so much for. I really appreciate you exploring the kind of nuances there of prejudice and hatred and systemic aspects of racism. And because when I mentioned that quote, uh, the the thing that I felt they were communicating was that they believed everyone carries a kind of like an unconscious projected kind of malignant hatred for someone, that they're playing out some, and I don't believe that's the case. I think there are plenty of people who don't have that, but I may have used the word prejudice, which yeah, you're right to point to, not advocating some naive everyone's colorblind and not affected by the kind of systemic racism that we live in. But yeah, I think I'm a big fan of bell hooks, and she writes all about this kind of intersection of love not just being a feeling, it being an act as well, in terms of justice is an absolutely core part
That's right.
of.
Yeah, and to think about love as a power, love as a
Mm,
faculty that we can grow in and grow into. Um, I mean, we sometimes talk about love as this thing. I love you today. I may not love you tomorrow. I loved you yesterday, but I won't. It has changed now. And instead, to think about love as almost like well-being and health that
yeah.
we can grow into, and that it's not a finite thing.
And we haven't spoken about kind of self love. Do you see that as an important part of one's spiritual practice?
I do, and uh, with the small caveat that self-love cannot simply be the love of that very
Mm-hmm.
small, right, center of the world, pharaoh self that we were trying to
Yeah,
move.
not an egoic, narcissistic love. Yeah.
That's it. I think it has something to do with the way that Christ talks about it. You have to learn to love your neighbor as yourself. And there are so many people who genuinely loathe themselves. Um, I'm a teacher and I teach primarily 18 to 22-year olds. I see so many people who hate their own bodies, and they've hated their bodies since puberty. Um, if you're filled with that kind of loathing for yourself, it's very difficult to love
Mm.
her and the stranger, right? And that at some point, there's people that are kind people, nice people. They would never in a million years think about going up to a random stranger and saying like, "You look disgusting." And yet every morning
Right.
they roll out of bed and they go first to brush their teeth and they look at themselves in the mirror. Their first thought is, who is this old, wrinkly, disgusting, right? And why is it that we cannot, that we either seem to be trapped into, uh, I am king of the world, I'm the center of the
Mm.
world, I'm the Lord on high, or you look like a piece of shit. And where is not that middle ground, but that higher ground where we would say, here's a child of God. Here's a divine manifestation. Here's yet another beautiful creature that God has made, no less beautiful and no more beautiful than anyone else. Um, and in our tradition, there's something that the Prophet, peace be upon him, has said, in which he says that in order to know God intimately, you have to learn to know yourself intimately. And so there is that notion of love and knowledge for one's own self, which is quite essential. And I think that's also important.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to what I said before about how, for me, I found that love, openness, awareness all ended up kind of intermingling into this one thing, and that there's a kind of witnessing of oneself, of compassionately, yeah, seeing all the different aspects of oneself that one may otherwise habitually shame and criticize, and having that love of opening up to oneself to make oneself more whole, and then that brings you more into alignment with the wholeness of existence. Yeah, that's the it's not a narcissistic egoic love of I'm so great, because that's the opposite really, because you're actually doing that to try to suppress and struggle with the bits of yourself that you don't want to open to. But yeah, thank you so much, Hamid. This has been wonderful. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Well, yeah, I would send them to the woods. I would tell them
That's the best
to,
answer I've ever had to the in the podcast so far. Usually, it's a website.
of course, of course. This is that part about the commercial commodified thing that,
Yeah, yeah.
which admittedly, I'm also, a part of. I don't pretend that I've completed it. But in all seriousness, I would say go to a place where you find yourself connected to something bigger than you. It might be a mountaintop, it might be a river, it might be the woods somewhere. It might be a cup of tea in the presence of someone who loves you deeply and intimately. Um, if you have been loved by parents and grandparents, go and get a big hug from them. If you have a child, go and sit with them and see if you can still recall the softness of their cheek and how enormous their eyes are, um, or the touch of a lover or a friend. Um, and that's the primary. Everything else is just commentary. And for the work that I do, we have a website, of course. It's www.illuminatedcourses.com. And there's information about the books, and we have some retreat programs and online courses that hopefully will keep sending you back to the mountaintop and keep to
Yeah.
all those real sources of rejuvenation.
Wonderful, great, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your friends for joining us.
I didn't add a point there. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll let you know when I release it as well.
That would be beautiful.
Yeah. All
Oh,
right.
and whenever you have a chance to release it, let me know. I'd be happy to mirror it on my side and send people over to
That'd be great.
your work as
Thank you.
well. And it would be. Oh, it's always nice to have some. I think of it as cross-pollination.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. All
Thank you
right.
so much. I
Thank you again.
appreciate it. All right.
Have a
Be
wonderful
well.
day.
Bye
Bye.
bye.